Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. So this time we're taking a look at the book you sent us, specifically chapter 13. And well, it's really all about breaking free from procrastination.
Ooh, that's always a popular topic.
Isn't it though?
Mm.
I mean, who hasn't struggled with procrastination at some point, right? But this chapter dives into some really interesting strategies for actually building those good habits we've been trying to, lock in for who knows how long.
Yeah, I think we've all got those ideal versions of ourselves in our heads, but actually making those changes stick, that's the tricky part.
For sure. And that's where this thing called the 2-minute rule comes in.
Okay, the 2-minute rule. Color me intrigued. What's that all about?
Well, it sounds kind of simple on the surface, but stick with me here. The chapter kicks off with this really cool story about Twyla Tharp, the dancer and choreographer.
Yeah, I know her work. Super talented.
Totally. So every single morning, she had this ritual. She'd put on her workout clothes and tell a cab to take her to the gym. That's it. That was her trigger.
Huh. Seems pretty basic, but I guess it worked for her, right?
Exactly. And the chapter really digs into why something so simple can be so powerful. It's all about those small, almost like insignificant choices that we make each day.
Right, like those little decisions that we don't even really think about, but they end up shaping our entire day. The chapter calls them decisive moments.
Yes, decisive moments. I love that. And you know what's wild? The chapter says that something like 40% of our daily actions are actually driven by habit.
Whoa, 40%. That's almost half our day running on autopilot.
Crazy, Ray.
Hey.
It makes you realize just how important it is to understand those habits, good or bad, because they're shaping our lives whether we're paying attention or not.
It's like we're on this predetermined track and we don't even realize it.
Exactly. The chapter uses this great analogy, like a tree diagram, right?
Yeah.
Every choice we make is like a branch, and those little decisive moments, they kind of accumulate and determine whether we end up having a productive day or one where we feel like we're just, spinning our wheels.
I like that. So where does this 2-minute rule thing come in?
Well, the book kind of presents it as this secret weapon, like this hack for taking control of those habits and finally, overcoming that procrastination monster.
Okay, I'm listening. So how does it work? Lay it on me. What's the secret?
It's actually deceptively simple. You take any habit you want to build, and you shrink it down, you scale it back to just a 2-minute version.
A 2-minute version? Can you give me an example?
Sure. So instead of saying, I'm going to run 3 miles today, you'd say, I'm going to put on my running shoes. Or instead of aiming for an hour of reading before bed, you just commit to reading 1 page.
Huh. So it's like tricking your brain into getting started, right? Because sometimes even those small tasks can feel impossible when you're in that procrastination mode.
It's not just a trick, though. There's actually some real psychology behind why this works. The chapter explains that by making that initial action super easy, we're lowering that resistance. It's like removing the barrier to entry.
So those 2 minutes act like a gateway to the bigger habit.
Exactly. And the chapter highlights this twofold benefit. First, it turns that desired action into a gateway habit, making it way more appealing. And second, it establishes a kind of ritualized starting point that over time actually increases your chances of getting into a state of deep focus.
Okay, I'm starting to see the logic here, but honestly, what's to stop me from putting on my running shoes and then just being like, nope, I'd rather watch TV?
Right, what's the motivation to keep going? Well, the chapter addresses that directly, actually. It says the 2-minute rule isn't about limiting yourself to just those 2 minutes. It's about using that tiny action to build momentum. It's a springboard.
Like you're priming the pump, so to speak.
Exactly. It's like, think back to Twyla Tharp in that cab. That simple act was the catalyst for hours of practice.
Right.
It was that first step that got her going. And the rest is history.
I see. So the real power of this 2-minute rule lies in using those 2 minutes to trigger a whole cascade of actions leading to the outcome you want.
Exactly. It helps you create a ritual, a starting point. That makes those good habits, almost inevitable.
So it's not just about getting started, it's about making that start as frictionless as possible.
Exactly. And once you've got that momentum, it's easier to keep going. Hashtag TTS, The Deep Dive, episode 2025, ZO305, part 2 of 3.
And it's funny, this whole approach kind of flips the script on how we usually think about mastery.
You mean like becoming really good at something?
Exactly. We always picture it as this huge, almost impossible goal, something that takes tons of effort and sacrifice.
Right, like you have to go all in or not bother at all.
Yeah, that's the common narrative. But what if the key to actually mastering something is hidden in those first 2 minutes?
I think I see where you're going with this. The chapter talks about how the 2-minute rule isn't about limiting yourself to just 2 minutes forever, right?
Exactly. It's not about staying at that basic level. It's more like using those 2 minutes as a foundation. Think of it like a launch pad.
So how do we go from just those 2 minutes to, actually getting good at something or achieving a bigger goal?
Well, the key is to gradually increase the duration or maybe the complexity of the habit. Once that initial 2-minute action becomes like second nature to you.
Oh, so it's like building a muscle, right? You start with lighter weights and then gradually increase as you get stronger.
That's a great analogy. It's not about intensity, it's more about consistency.
That makes sense. But wouldn't we get bored or lose motivation if we're only focusing on those first 2 minutes? I mean, how do we stay engaged and not just stop after those 2 minutes?
Well, that's where the whole idea of a gateway habit comes in. The idea is once you start that 2-minute version, you're actually more likely to want to keep going with the full activity. It's like you open a door to a room you never knew was there.
Oh, I see. Like you get a taste and you want more.
Exactly. And the chapter even talks about this idea of ritualizing the start of something.
What do you mean by that?
So, the more you make the beginning of something a ritual, a specific routine, the easier it becomes to slip into that focused state. Like, before I sit down to write, I always make a cup of tea, light a candle, put on my favorite playlist. It's a simple thing, but it tells my brain it's time to work.
Ah, so it's like a mental cue, a signal to get started.
You got it. It's all about those triggers, helping you get in the right mindset.
I love this. This is really making me rethink how I approach things. But is there ever a time when we should actually stick to just those 2 minutes?
You know what there is? The chapter actually suggests using the 2-minute rule for dealing with bad habits, too.
Whoa, now that's interesting. How would that work?
So the idea is by intentionally limiting yourself to just 2 minutes of a bad habit, you actually reduce its hold over you. Like, let's say you're trying to cut back on social media. You could set a timer for 2 minutes, scroll through your feed, and then stop when the timer goes off.
Huh, that's pretty clever. It's like setting boundaries, right? Preventing things from getting out of control.
Exactly. And it also makes you more aware of how much time you're actually spending on those habits. Like sometimes we don't even realize how much time we waste on things that aren't really good for us.
So the 2-minute rule, it's like a double-edged sword. You can use it for good habits and for breaking bad ones. Super versatile.
It is. It's like a Swiss Army knife for habit change.
Yeah.
And the best part, it can be applied to all sorts of goals and challenges.
Okay, so we've talked about building good habits, breaking bad ones, but there's this other section in the chapter that caught my eye. It's called habit shaping.
Oh yeah, habit shaping. It's basically a system for breaking down those big, complex goals into smaller, more manageable steps. The chapter even gives some concrete examples, like becoming a vegan, or starting an exercise routine, or becoming a morning person.
Right, and it lays it all out in phases, almost like a step-by-step guide.
Exactly, 5 phases to be exact. And it makes those scary, big goals seem so much more doable.
Can you walk us through one of the examples? I think it'd be helpful for our listeners to hear what this looks like in practice.
Sure. Let's take becoming a morning person. Right. The book breaks it down like this. Phase 1. Be home by 10 p.m. every night. Phase 2. Have all devices, like your TV and phone, off by 10 p.m.
Okay, I'm following. What's next?
Phase 3. Be in bed by 10 p.m., maybe reading a book or chatting with your partner. Phase 4. Lights out at 10 p.m., no exceptions. And finally, Phase 5. Wake up at 6 a.m. every day.
Wow, it's like a recipe for becoming a morning person. It's so clear.
Right. And each phase builds on the one before it, so it's a gradual progression towards your goal. And of course, you can use the 2-minute rule in each phase to make it even easier to get started.
It's like that saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. This habit shaping thing gives you the roadmap for those big goals. You just tackle them one step at a time.
Exactly. It's all about breaking it down. Those little wins add up, and eventually you make a big change without even realizing it.
This whole conversation about the 2-minute rule and habits has been so insightful. But before we wrap things up, there's one more thing from the chapter I wanted to touch on. The idea of commitment devices.
Oh yeah, like Victor Hugo locking away all his clothes except for a shawl so he could focus on writing.
Exactly. It seemed extreme, but it clearly worked for him.
It did. A commitment device is basically anything you do to lock in a future behavior. Like you're binding yourself to your goals and making it harder to fall back into those bad habits.
So it's about setting up those external barriers, those safeguards, to keep you on track even when you don't feel like it.
That's the idea. The chapter talks about all kinds of commitment devices, like using website blockers, setting up automatic savings plans, or even getting a friend to hold you accountable. It's all about creating an environment that helps you stay focused.
I love that. It's like setting yourself up for success.
Exactly. And, sometimes we need a little extra help to stay on track, especially when willpower alone isn't enough.
So we've covered a lot of ground today: the 2-minute rule, habit shaping, and commitment devices. It feels like we've really explored some great strategies for tackling procrastination and building better habits.
I agree. It's amazing how much we can accomplish just by starting small and focusing on consistency. Hashtag TTS, the Deep Dive episode 2025-0305, part 3 of 3. You know what I really like about this whole 2-minute rule thing? It's like, it changes the way we think about making changes in our lives.
Yeah, like how so?
Well, we often get stuck in this mindset that we need to make these huge, dramatic changes to see any real results.
Oh yeah, I totally get that. Like we need to join a gym, buy all the fancy equipment, and work out for hours every day. It can feel so overwhelming.
Right. But the 2-minute rule, it reminds us that it's not about the size of the action, it's about how consistently we do it.
It's like those small, steady steps, those little commitments we make that over time can really add up.
Exactly. It's like that saying, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Mm.
The 2-minute rule is about taking that very first step and then another one until it becomes like this unstoppable force.
I love how this approach kind of throws out that all or nothing thinking a lot of us get trapped in. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up and doing something, even if it's just for those 2 minutes.
That's the beauty of it. It makes it so much easier to actually stick with it. It takes the pressure off and lets us have fun with it.
It's like making it a game instead of this chore we dread.
Right. It's about celebrating those tiny wins, those little moments of progress, and letting that fuel our motivation.
And, thinking back to Twyla Tharp and that taxi ritual, it seems like she really got this. Her ritual wasn't about forcing yourself to do this grueling workout. It was about setting up this consistent starting point that made it easier to create.
Yeah, that's a good point. It wasn't about punishment. It was about setting herself up for success. And that's really what the 2-minute rule is all about. It's about making it easier to do the things that bring us joy and help us grow.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into this chapter, I want to leave our listeners with a little something to think about. What's one tiny 2-minute action you can take today to get a little closer to your goals, to build a new habit, or just make your life a little bit better?
That's a great question to ponder. And remember, it doesn't have to be this big, complicated thing. Those tiny commitments, those small steps, those are the things that can lead to some pretty amazing transformations down the road.
This has been such a cool exploration of the 2-minute rule. I'm already thinking about all the ways I can use this in my own life.
Me too. And I hope our listeners are feeling inspired as well.
We've talked about so much today: building good habits, breaking bad ones, even using those commitment devices to help us stay on track. But I think the main takeaway here is that it doesn't have to be overwhelming. We don't have to try to change everything at once.
Right. It's about taking it one step at a time, one 2-minute action at a time.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. We hope you enjoyed exploring the 2-minute rule with us.
And as always, keep learning, keep exploring, keep diving deep into the things that spark your curiosity.
And be sure to join us next time for another deep dive into a brand new topic. Until then, happy habit building.